Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So we are going to be doing another video lecture today. This one is going to be pretty short, I would say, honestly, largely because the chapter in the book is pretty short, so there's not as much to talk about. But I did want to double back on some of the things we talked about previously. So previously we were talking about the Enlightenment. You know, the Enlightenment was this time of reason, this time of improving people's lives, because that was one of the goals of of Enlightenment era philosophers. But today we're going to look at sort of the limitations of that perspective, because when we look at that, we have to realize that even while all these philosophers are advocating, improving people's lives, changing the world, making things better, there's a lot about their society that they really haven't changed yet, and is kind of keeping them from, or they, in some cases, have blinders on. In other cases, recognize the hypocrisy of their position, but haven't yet changed the system. So I think it's worth knowing, when we have this philosophy that says we can be perfectly logical and rational and we can make the world better that way, what are we missing? If we think we're all so logical already, it's be very easy to miss something important. And so there are a few different things I want to talk about today, as well as talk about a few more philosophers and the overall sort of mood at this time period. So we're still staying in the 1600s and 1700s here for this discussion. But we might have to dip back into some earlier time periods just to talk about certain things. For instance, the big thing that really comes up when we talk about the philosophers of the Enlightenment not being as enlightened as they wanted to think that they were is slavery. So as is well known in the United States, slavery was practiced from basically the 1500s onward, but it really took off in the 1600s and stayed around until the 1800s when the American Civil War was fought largely over the existence of slavery. Even though people like Lincoln didn't want to come out right out and say that they were interested in freeing slaves, it ultimately ended up being the result of the war, in part because the South feared that Lincoln would free slaves. But that's all much later on in the time period. We're still looking at it in the Enlightenment era. So to start off with, it seems like slavery as an institution was basically as old as dirt. Capturing somebody and forcing them to do work for you was very old. And then from that emerged the process of buying and selling living people. However, there were some distinctions between sort of more recent slavery and the slavery as practiced by Greeks and Romans, for instance. The slavery practiced by Greeks and Romans was often temporary, and there wasn't really a strong racial component to it. In Greece and Rome, you could often buy your way out of slavery if you worked long enough. You could sometimes go into slavery as a form of debt, just because you weren't able to repay someone you'd borrowed from. And most importantly, slavery was not thought of as a hereditary thing, and it was not thought of as a lifelong thing. Slavery was not thought of as something that was only for a particular race of people. Slavery in Greece and Rome was thought of as a temporary thing, but certainly not necessarily a lifelong thing. For some people, it was lifelong, but it wasn't a hard and fast rule, and many people were freed by the end of their lives. And their children, very importantly, did not inherit that status. In the Americas, it was very different. And so on one level, they kind of continued off. Slavery never really went away as a concept, and they kind of picked up where the Greeks and Romans left off. On the other hand, they changed it by making the focus very heavily on race. Specifically, one group of people, descendants of Africans, and really Africans at the start, were treated as racially inferior, and that was used as a moral justification for enslaving them. But it didn't start off that way. Back when the Americas were first being colonized, there was about an equal amount of Native American slavery and various forms of sort of white labor bondage that was more temporary. And then after that, African slaves were brought in. And that started to change the way that slavery was being thought about. Slavery in Africa was something that many people practiced. So there were many African kings who kept slaves. But like with the Greeks and Romans, it was mostly just prisoners of war, people who were captured in battle. It would be somebody would conquer or raid somebody else, take people prisoner. That was sort of the overall vibe of the time. Um, and so it wasn't quite clear to people just how ridiculous a scale slavery was going to operate under eventually. So Europeans kind of continued this tradition, but now they were sailing over to Africa. They met people who were there and said, hey, we'll buy slaves from you. And pretty soon a cottage industry of capturing people as slaves started to develop in Africa. And so African slaves were taken over in terrible conditions. If you look at this image, one reason we start off here is this is the kind of level of packing of people that was going on these boats. Just absolute like density, absolutely inhumane conditions. People just chained together in ridiculously tight quarters on ships with terrible food and water. A horrendous, hellish experience. Even if you weren't in the situation, sailing at that time was pretty hellish. So these slaves were brought over to the Americas and parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, and were isolated, taken away from their original homes and their languages, and made to work for white planters. And it happened in other parts of Europe as well, but it really dominated in the Americas, and especially among Virginians. And the South in general had a strong tradition of slavery as a labor force, basically to extract sort of wealth and profits like the profits of cotton, tobacco, and indigo dye. So the funny thing is, or not funny, but ironic thing, I guess you could say, is that a lot of the philosophers in America were Virginians themselves, people who owned slaves. So we have this time period where everybody's talking about the nature of freedom, and yet they're not really able or willing to grant it to those who are most unfree. And they do kind of notice the contradiction here. It's not a complete blind spot. People are uncomfortable with this reality. But it's kind of almost like the status of slaves as being a negative one reinforce some ideas about freedom. For instance, in the French Revolution, in Virginia, everybody said, oh, this king, this leader can't make us slaves. We are free people. And so maybe there's a kind of looking down on slaves that's kind of being implied there. On the other hand, some people definitely can see the connection and think, maybe slavery is not such a good thing. Maybe slavery is something that we should avoid. And so there were certainly people calling for slavery to stop. The trouble is it was economically effective. And so people started to justify it more and more and more and more. You may know that the American Constitution and Declaration of Independence, there were many debates over how to discuss slavery in that context. And as time went on after that, slavery was attempted to be justified on a theory of race. So basically pseudoscience of race. The idea of Black people being inferior to white people was a false idea that certain people really wanted to believe because it let them keep doing what they were doing. They say, oh, we're just, taking care of people. We're just taking care of the slaves. We're just giving them food and they couldn't really work and survive on their own. They're not smart enough, stuff like that. So there was this justification, which was, let me be clear, based on absolutely nothing other than they wanted to keep having slaves. And I think it might be kind of the dark side of some of this Enlightenment, scientifically figuring out the world and classifying the world, is that we had a long tradition of pseudoscience too, stuff that sounded like science and sounded like rational thinking, but was actually based on nothing but just one's own biases. That's a real danger when you adopt a sort of rational philosophy. So there were definitely some contradictions and problems. Maybe the person who most represents the contradiction inherent here is Thomas Jefferson, the third American president. He was perhaps one of the biggest philosophers of freedom and social norms and social contracts of why people should be free of tyranny from kings and stuff like that, and how to have a democracy. But he was a slave owner, and in fact, he was very contradictory on the issue of slavery. On the one hand, in the Declaration of Independence, he said it's bad, or he tried to write that it's bad. He said that, this is one of the bad things the king has done, has continued the tradition of slavery. And so that fit right in with all the people who believed, yeah, this is bad. On the other hand, Jefferson never really freed his slaves, and we know that many slaves were descended from him, meaning he had sex with his slaves, which is not cool in any way, shape, or form, because slaves are not able to, say no. So this is the person of Thomas Jefferson. It's not trying to drag him into the mud, just to acknowledge that he was already kind of there. And that's kind of the nature of these philosophers. Not all of them. Certainly, Thomas Jefferson is the most extreme case, where he could say slavery is bad while still not really doing anything to stop practicing it himself, and being able to compartmentalize it, maybe. Other philosophers were less directly involved, but they didn't end up changing the system. Changing the system didn't really happen until the 1800s. There was a real movement led, in part on religious grounds, that this was morally wrong on a religious level. And so it became illegal to get new slaves in Britain and eventually in America. But in America, this tradition of slavery still existed. In Britain, it was no longer allowed for people to be enslaved. And then eventually we had the American Civil War. I should mention one of the arguments was that slavery would actually be economically negative. Adam Smith, the founder of sort of modern economics, argued that basically you should have free things, you should have free trade, and so you should also have free labor. If people aren't able to choose whether they work or not, then they do not make as good economic decisions, and the economy doesn't grow. And I think that's a fair point. But also, let's not forget that slavery is just evil. And maybe in the Greek and Roman times, it wasn't as clear how evil it was, but the fact that it could be taken to this level is pretty much a sign. Yeah, that's pretty much the long and short of it there. That was one of the sort of holes in thinking that were shared by a lot of Enlightenment philosophers. Another one was, just race in general, different races or different peoples in the world, and the idea of European culture being superior to other cultures. This was in part responsible for the colonization of many parts of the world. So what do I mean by colonization? Basically just taking over other regions. Because of their economic growth and their interest in controlling trade and resources and stuff like that, from a period about the 1500s onward, European countries were in competition to see who could make the most money the fastest. Now this did help life in those places like France and Britain, and Spain is making money. That sort of led to things growing and lots of people finding new sort of situations and kind of moving away from some old parts of the way things were. On the other hand, this was basically, the goal was not a moral one. It was exploiting other regions. And again, the people tried to justify this on racial grounds. Oh, well, white people or European people have the best culture, and so we should spread it to everybody, make everybody Christian, teach everybody everything we know, and that's why we're doing this. It's not because we want to conquer various things and get money and resources from that. Oh, no. It was, in fact, that latter one. But yeah, this map here should get you a sense of kind of the colonization going on. It hasn't gotten to its furthest extreme. Its furthest extreme is when everybody's going to try and take over Africa in Europe, and Africa is going to lose big because of that and really suffer. But for now, you can see some of the patterns of where different things are. Spain has most of this stuff, which makes it amazing they gave up the part of America that they had. Portugal is over here having Brazil. You've got France has some stuff. The United States is broken off by the 1800s, but Britain has Canada. There's all sorts of stuff going on. And so this leads to basically places like Britain having outposts around the world where they kind of try to control the local culture, try to enforce their values, which is really the theme of European colonialism more than other societies taking things over. This idea of you should have our values and our religion and our way of life, and also we think you're inferior to us. That stuff is not so good. And so that was another big blind spot for a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers. Or they could talk about it a little, but they didn't really know how to talk about it in depth. Yeah, one I especially want to mention is the British Empire in India. Over the 1600s and 1700s, a British sort of merchant company called the East India Company took over India in various steps and sort of subjected the different regions there to a British government. So it would sort of go like British people, then like a higher level of higher up Indian people, and then a lower level of Indian people who were poorer under that. So it was partially through conquest and partially through indirect control. But that led to things like basically India having to have an independence movement later. In fact, you know, all of these regions that are getting taken over having to have independence movements later on. So it's quite a lot. And again, people try to justify things by the idea of being a superior culture. I think today we have moved away from the idea of superior and inferior cultures. There may be cultures that have, you know, more advanced technology or something like that, but that doesn't really give them the right to take over other places. But during this time period, it was much less clear in the eyes of people who were thinking about it, like various philosophers. Now, some people did respond to this. One very interesting case is Rousseau. Rousseau, it was one of these philosophers who thought a lot about the nature of society, but his response to things was quite different. There was a lot of discussion over like primitive society, by which they meant stuff more like living in tribes, Native American culture, stuff like that. Primitive society, there were 2 points of view on it. The philosopher Hobbes, who we met previously, argued that in the original primitive society, he imagined something free of any sort of law or government. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. Those were the words that he used, meaning you have a bad time if you're living in a tribal society. And so the goal should be to move on into a kingdom or ideally into a more organized society like the one he was living in. Alternatively, you have Rousseau. And Rousseau argued that society was actually terrible and that a primitive society was actually better. And so you can maybe detect some sympathy here for Native Americans, and he argued that Europeans were doing a great disservice by conquering Native Americans and by the institution of slavery. You know, he argued that that was quite bad and, you know, a sign of the modern corruption of society. He believed that society just inherently corrupted people. He believed we start off good and then we're taught to be bad. Whereas Hobbes would probably say we start off bad and then we learn to be good by building a society. I kind of think there's a grain of truth in both ways of looking at it. But what Rousseau did is he came up with this concept of the noble savage, that Native Americans and other sort of more tribal people were superior sorts of people who we should strive to emulate. And we should strive to move away from the evil ideas of our society. Now, in practice, I mean, this sounds like a good point of view, but in practice, this was kind of putting Native Americans on a pedestal. It's clear that Rousseau didn't really understand them or who they actually were. And if he had met them, he probably would have been disappointed by them because they didn't live up to his expectations or his ideas about them. You know, they could do bad things. Believing that, you know, nobody can do bad things is in its own way just as reductive as believing that nobody in the culture can do good things. But he is kind of interesting as a contrasting response, kind of in the wrong opposite direction. Okay, I want to mention at this point a philosopher I didn't get to last time, and this is Diderot. So Diderot's an interesting guy. Diderot's goal was to write a great encyclopedia. And that is, a really sort of classic example of the kind of stuff we're talking about for Enlightenment philosophers, right? He's trying to find all the knowledge of the world, and he really believes he can put it all in one book. He's got, physics and electricity and engineering and mathematics. He's going to collect it all. And he was actually a very well-connected dude who seems to have gathered a lot of knowledge from other people. So he knew a lot of the other Enlightenment philosophers, and he put all their stuff in his book. And so this was, the first encyclopedia of the modern era, the first Wikipedia, almost in a way, the goal of gaining and gathering as much knowledge as possible. It's a pretty good goal. Now, he didn't get along very well with the church because he was pretty practical and realistic, and so he didn't really believe in the miracles that were said to happen in the Bible. He tried to say, this was somebody was mistaken about this, or they didn't understand this, or this was just a lie. And so that got him in hot water with the church. He was banned by the Catholic Church. He was not supposed to, the book was not allowed to be published or sold in anywhere that they had any control. But people circulated copies of it in secret. He was fairly disappointed by this, understandably, but the ban was eventually lifted after his death. He didn't die of, he wasn't burned at the stake or anything, but his book almost was. And he's another one where it's kind of some blind spots there. On the one hand, he writes in a really fascinated way about the societies of Asia and of the Middle East, as we call it, the Muslim regions of the world in Africa and Western Asia. He really found them fascinating, and he wanted to put information about them in his book. And he tried to say, these are not bad necessarily. We should not consider them inferior. On the other hand, a lot of the stuff he wrote about them, we would now kind of consider stereotypes. Arabs are like this, and Chinese people are like this. So it's tricky. I think this was just a time period where people believed much more in the idea that different races had very strong inherent characteristics. And at this point, we've realized that all the justification behind that was made up. So again, we have a sort of scientist or a logical person who doesn't kind of see when they're not basing it on evidence 100%. Okay, so those are some of the main blind spots. Now, this was also a time where we had like the Industrial Revolution, which was both good and bad. There was new technology that could improve people's lives. There was also a lot of really horrible things, horrible factory conditions that came out of the Industrial Revolution. So it didn't improve those people's lives. It made their working conditions a lot worse. There was a lot to worry about. And a lot of the philosophers that we've been looking at were basically rich people. I mean, almost always. It's about the aristocracy who has the time to write philosophy. So this was a time period with a lot of problems. And a lot of them were satirized. This is a time period of satire. So satire is basically, when you sort of parody something by writing a version of it that's most extreme to a ridiculous degree. And we have modern versions of satire, like the Colbert Report is satire of conservative ideas and things like that. So this is a time period where satire really took off. One of the satire authors was a guy named Molière, who wrote some plays that satirized things. Another of them was Jonathan Swift, who who made enemies with his satire and had to move to Ireland because he was being, persecuted or sued in England. And he was an Irishman, and he really, he really respected Irish beliefs and culture and fought for Ireland to have its own sort of free, independent existence. But he is most known for his satire. One of his works of satire is Gulliver's Travels, in which a guy travels around the world, like a lot of people were doing at that time, kind of gets lost and winds up in all these strange countries where they do all sorts of weird and different things. The most famous one is where he ends up in the country of the tiny people, and they all tie him up because he's a giant, and they're terrified of him. But then later on, he ends up in the land of the giant people. He also ends up in the land where the people are dumb, but they are or they ride around on these horses who are very intelligent and are in fact really running the show. So what he could do with these is he could parody different aspects of society in his satire. And so that kind of helped people, see the ridiculous nature of their own society. A more controversial work by him is called A Modest Proposal. In A Modest Proposal, Jonathan Swift says, okay, so there's some problems in this world. There's all this poverty, and then there's, all this suffering. So why don't we just eat some babies? That was basically his modest proposal was, I think a baby would be quite delicious. And if we ate them, then we would help solve the problems of poverty. And what a lot of people didn't get, even at the time and even now, was that he was satirizing. He was making this exaggerated version of things. He didn't actually think that people should eat babies, but people were shocked by him even venturing to say such a thing. And his point was that, the way people treat the poor is not that much better than if they just ate their babies. So we need to have a more compassionate way of treating people. Okay, so going back to Moliere, I want to show a brief clip. It won't show up super well on Zoom, but we can kind of get a sense of it. From his play Tartuffe. So Tartuffe is kind of about the story of a cuckold in a way. A man is, this priest kind of invades his home, but the priest is actually a con artist who steals his wife. And so this is kind of a sign of parodying priests in the church, that in this time period, people were becoming more comfortable with the idea of, that priests could not be good people necessarily. And so it was funny and pointed to parody this priest who is very puffed up, but is in fact a scammer, a con artist. So let me see. We definitely want to have the sound here. So we'll just watch a little bit to get a sense of it. From Tartuffe, kind of near the climax. There we go, now it's loading.
You wearied of a saintly life, wedding my daughter and coveting my wife? I've long suspected you and had a feeling that I'd soon catch you at your double dealing. Just now you've given me evidence galore. It's quite enough. I have no wish for more.
I'm sorry to have treated you so slyly, but circumstances forced me to be wily.
Brother, you can't think. No more talk from you. Just leave this household without more ado. What I intended. That seems fairly clear. Spare me your falsehoods and get out of here. No. I'm the master. You're the one to go. This house belongs to me, I'll have you know. And I'll show you that you can't hurt me by this contemptible conspiracy. And those who cross me know not what they do, that I means to expose and punish you, avenge offended heaven, and make you grieve that ever you dared order me to leave.
All right, so that's a lot, isn't it? Yeah, you can see the fun and but also kind of some of the seriousness of the play as a form of satire, everybody being very extreme. Okay, now let's see if I can click out of here. Just a second here. Okay, so a couple more things I want to talk about. So one of them is Voltaire. Voltaire was a very good satirist, as well as a very good philosopher. He really discoursed on things like science and knowledge. And we should remember that all these philosophers, they're not just writing about the social sciences, they're writing about the things like astronomy and chemistry and electricity and geology as well, because it's all thought of as one thing at this point. And Voltaire was one of these sort of many subjected polymath geniuses. He also wrote poetries and plays and philosophy and history. This was a time period where everybody could do everything, really. So Voltaire was sort of the critical voice of the Enlightenment. He would often criticize those in power, and he had a very sharp wit and a sharp tongue, which made him certain enemies. For instance, when he argued for the ideas of Locke, who had that idea of the social contract that people form with their governments, he irritated a lot of people and so was exiled from his home country of France. But eventually he ended up in England, and that worked out for him. He was a defender of liberalism, which is a concept I haven't really talked about. Some people, when they say liberal, they mean like a political progressive. Some people, when they say liberal, mean someone who is more political center. So it's a little confusing. The reason for this is that liberalism is based on like liberation, the word for free. So liberalism is really a political philosophy that is about increasing freedom in some way or another. And so in this time period, the Enlightenment is when that concept really gets developed. And so what they basically argue for is freedom of religion, freedom of choice, freedom of the press, things like that, but also free markets. Free economic activity that is not interfered with by the government. So that means that a liberal in the modern sense would tend to be maybe politically progressive, but more economically conservative in that they aren't that interested in government interaction with the economy. So that's liberalism, and that was sort of part of Voltaire's philosophy. He was also a very big critic of religion. He was not content to let sleeping popes lie. He was not content to let people in religion who were getting away with something get away with it. But nor was he content among his fellow philosophers to let people get away with bad ideas. His most famous work is probably Candide. So Candide has an interesting backstory. The philosopher Leibniz argued that basically things were as they should be, more or less. People lived in the best of all possible worlds. Now, why did he argue this? Well, because God is good. So God would create a good world, and if the world isn't good, the things in it are still as good as they could be. God couldn't have created a better world if he tried. That's basically the idea there that Leibniz had, was that because things are, the way things are is just so that this is the best that things could be. And, it's not necessarily as good as we might imagine it to be, but there would be a reason why things were arranged as they are. And so, maybe if that's a comforting philosophy, maybe not. But unfortunately, a lot of people took that and ran with it a little too far and said that basically, best of all possible worlds, that means that like everything that happens is always good, right? And I don't think that's what Leibniz was originally trying to say with that. He was more trying to make an expression about, this is the best we've got. The world is kind of the way the world is because it had to be. But there were a lot of people who ran around saying, oh, everything is great, and the design of the world is perfect, and nothing bad ever happens. And Voltaire hated this. He thought this was so stupid. One of the big incidents in this was there was a wave off the shore of Portugal. There was really a tsunami type of thing, like we see sometimes in Japan, that absolutely just destroyed lives. We guess that about like 20,000 people were killed by the Portuguese tidal wave or tsunami. And so people were horrified and saddened by this. But some philosophers tried to say, oh, well, it's all for the good, it'll lead to good things down the road. And Voltaire said, no, we cannot abide this type of thinking about things. That's a horrendous way to think about it. And so he wrote the novel Candide. And in Candide is the story of a young, very naive young man who meets a philosopher called Dr. Pangloss, who is kind of a parody of this type of philosopher. His name means kind of, he puts a gloss on everything. he makes everything feel good. And so this young man goes on a series of wacky adventures where more and more horrible things just keep happening to him. But his philosopher buddy keeps saying, oh, it's great. Oh, you lost your leg? Oh, well, that's good because you'll get a better one or something. Just ridiculous things like that. And so that's maybe the thing that Voltaire is the most famous for, and arguably his most perfect work of satire. Okay, there's a couple more things I want to mention. Among the philosophers, another I didn't mention last time is Madame du Chaillu. Madame du Chaillu was quite the Renaissance, well, not Renaissance, quite the Enlightenment woman. She was a scholar as much as any of the rest of these folks. She was knowledgeable in mathematics and philosophy, and in her commentary on Newton's sort of Principia, which was his book on mathematics and physics, she continued some of his ideas and extended them out further. And she was basically, for instance, the first to define the concept of the conservation of energy. So the idea that energy will always exist, it just takes different forms. And the overall level of energy remains constant. Now, the odd thing about her is that people kind of neglected her intellectual contributions because she's also known for her sort of romantic contributions as well. She was the mistress of Voltaire and remained close to him through his entire life. And so she had these very complicated romantic entanglements with these Renaissance philosophers. But she was also, in a way, kind of a leader figure for them in that she organized them, she got them all together. She held salons, which are basically these sort of discussion parties, which were a big part of intellectual life in France. So she brought people together to discuss and to debate and to share their ideas. So she was the type of person who was an organizing force for this time period. So I think it's fitting that we remember her own contributions as well as her role as a leader and not just a side character in Voltaire's story, even though their story together is quite interesting. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about, I should mention that Voltaire, du Chaillu, yeah, they had some bad takes on religion and race as well. Not as bad as some other people, not as bad as Thomas Jefferson, but more just that they believed in stereotypes about the Jews and things like that. So it's tricky. Nobody really comes out looking super great in this time period. And if we think about why, it's like, well, the people didn't have the ideas in their heads of that people are basically the same all around the world in terms of the core things that matter. There was just a lot more suspicion. And I think some of the ideas of trying to classify people and understand the different societies around the world, that's not inherently bad, but because people hadn't really figured out, things like, how human race works, or human ethnicity is basically just a bunch of categories that we came up with. Skin color doesn't really have anything to do with anything other than, what part of the world you've been in and how much sun that part of the world gets. But because they hadn't figured that stuff out yet, we were kind of left with some holes in their philosophy. But anyway, leaving all that for now, the last thing I'm really going to talk about is the idea of revolutions. So a lot of these philosophers were really antsy about the idea of making a better, more democratic society, but they lived in a world of kings and queens and overlords. So it's not surprising that they would seek to overthrow these kings and queens. One of the big moments for this, as you might guess, is the American Revolution, which was largely successful in its goals of escaping the control of the King of England and establishing a new society based on certain democratic principles. And they were pretty successful in some ways. Of course, they also had the institution of slavery. But if we were able to ignore that, which maybe we shouldn't be able to, but they also had a certain problem, which is the first time America was tried, it didn't really work. And this is something nobody really talks about, but there's like a 10-year period where America is the United States of America is a thing, is a country, but it isn't really a country that works. States are sort of on the verge of breaking away all the time. There's some rebellions because the taxes are a point of concern. It's kind of a mess. And eventually what they realized is that it was more a loose connection of states, and it needed to be one sort of unified government. And so we moved from an old form of government, the Articles of Confederation, that worked for those 10 years. And those Articles of Confederation, they had like their own leaders and things, their own presidents, but they reworked everything with the Constitution and started again. And that time it worked. That time they were able to install George Washington as president and then just kind of proceed from there. The subject of how well America works as a country could fill multiple other classes. But for now, we will just say that, some things about it, I think it definitely achieved some of its goals, but the system of government was not perfect either. Maybe the biggest legacy is that it was an inspiration to countries around the world to have revolutions and to set up democratic governments, including the French. Now, the French Revolution has a bit of a darker reputation. The French Revolution is much more negative. The ideals of the French Revolution were as noble as the American Revolution, possibly more noble because they weren't really dealing with as much slavery. The idea was, they would overthrow the kings who were corrupt and oppressing them. A big problem was that the peasantry was starving. The poor people were out of bread. There were severe food shortages, and the king wasn't doing anything about it. Nobody actually said let them have cake, let them eat cake instead of bread, but that sort of sums up the mood that people had at the time, that the aristocrats were disconnected from the French, from everything that was important, from the common people. And so this started off very well. They captured the kings. They stormed the big fort called the Bastille, where a lot of prisoners were being kept, and they set them free. And so this was all very exciting. There was a lot of meetings and talking about the way they want things to be: liberty, equality, and fraternity were the big sort of norms of the day and the things they wanted to strive for. Unfortunately, it went kind of downhill. Because it became basically, we'll just chop the heads off of all the rich people, which, there's some merit to that in a certain sense, but it got out of control, and, there was no negotiation process. It became just something that the aristocrats were afraid of. And so it set in, more and more fear. And so it got worse and worse. On top of that, after a certain point, it wasn't even the aristocrats who were being executed. It was people within the revolution itself. What a mess. There's this guy called Robespierre, who basically just, anyone who was his enemy, he would say they were an enemy of the revolution. And so he would get the mob to call for that person's execution. And so he'd have all this allied behind him. And this point of the French Revolution was known as the Terror. The sort of mob rule mentality where they were all putting themselves behind Robespierre, and it was out of control, and just good people were being killed. Eventually, Robespierre, the tables turned on him, and he was executed, and the things finally settled down after that. But the whole country was a mess, and there wasn't a functional government. Ultimately, the tragedy of the French Revolution is that it didn't lead to a democracy, at least not immediately. It led to another tyrant. It led to this guy called Napoleon, who we're going to talk about later on. But he was just basically, he was a king in all but name. He was a general who got people behind him and made the people like him, but he wasn't letting people vote or anything like that. So French Revolution, mostly a failure in that regard. That said, there's a lot to be said about the ideals being noble, and that revolting against tyranny is something that people should strive for. Today, of course, France is a democracy, and some part of that has to do with the French having their revolution back in the day. All right, so that went longer than I thought it would. Hopefully you guys bear with me for that. I appreciate you bearing with me. I will see you guys in the discussion question about the limitations of the Enlightenment and this idea of logic and reason. I think we've seen quite a few of them today, and I want to get a sense of what your guys' take on all of that is. And then next time we will talk more about art during the 1700s. All right, take care.